Everywhere you go, there's connections. This week, I learned a lot about life connections and networking. So those are some of the connections we make. Everywhere we turn, everywhere we look, we see connections. Sometimes it's a brilliant connection, like plugging a light bulb into a computer. Isn't that cool? Sometimes it's a not so brilliant connection, like overloading an outlet. Connections all over the place. Sometimes we have connections that you would never imagine, like being at a sports game with a whole bunch of strangers, and all of a sudden something good happens, and you're high-fiving the stranger, and you feel like you are now part of something bigger than you, like the Seahawks, right? Connections everywhere you go. Sometimes at that same sports game, you can have a connection or see a connection that looks like you are coming apart, and not so good. All of us hope for great, meaningful, romantic connections. And all of us fear car crashes when you connect two cars in a way they weren't designed to connect. But no matter what it is, life is full of puzzles and connections, and life is all about those connections. I believe that today's passage talks about what I think are the two most important connections in our life. And before we talk about those connections, though, I want to take just a moment and summarize today's passage. Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through the end of the chapter. And you have two really odd stories that seem weird and somewhat out of character for Jesus. The first story is this woman who comes desperate for her child. You have a desperate mom, comes to Jesus begging, please heal my child. And it appears as though Jesus insults her and then heals her child. It's like, whoa, where'd that come from? And then the next story, you have the friends of a deaf man that bring this guy to Jesus for healing. And Jesus does all this weird stuff, sticking his fingers in his ears and spitting and putting it on his tongue. And it's like, what's going on? And so as we look at these things I want you to think about, first of all, is how did they come to Jesus? And how did they bring other people to Jesus? And we'll look at Jesus' response. So we'll see throughout this that those two common themes are that they connect to Jesus and they connect others to Jesus. We're all about this here at River Valley. In fact, our mission statement is connect, grow, go. Connect to Jesus and connect others to Jesus. So let's jump into our passage. Mark chapter 7, verse 24. It says, Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. So what's going on here? You have Jesus, he wants a little break, right? He gets to this house, he says, hey, let's keep it quiet, just give me an evening to myself. Jesus doesn't get that. And all of a sudden, this woman is just following him around begging. Now, Matthew, when he tells the same story in Matthew chapter 15, he's not nearly as gentle about this woman. Because the way he tells the story is that she's following him around, begging over and over, and that Jesus doesn't say a word at first. He just ignores her. And so what do the disciples say to Jesus? Jesus, send her away, get rid of her. But finally, he responds here. So before we look at the response, why would this woman think that she had the right, or why does she have the boldness to come to Jesus this way? I mean, she's a Gentile and he's a Jewish rabbi. He's a Jewish teacher. So why would she think that she can follow this teacher around begging and pleading over and over? Is it that she has something cool or special about her? Well, if you think about this, in any given crowd, you have different types of people. You have everyday, ordinary people. You have some people in a crowd that are heroes. I see some of you out there. You have some people in a crowd that are a villain. You know, we've seen that with the Pharisees in these crowds. And last night when I said that, there's somebody that raised their hand in the back. Right? We have villains in crowds. And then in crowds, we have parents. Parents who understand that when they're desperate for their child, they don't have the time to think about how they look. They don't have the time to worry about, is all of this proper? Is everything, am I being everything I'm supposed to be? Because they're desperate. This woman, she comes to Jesus relentlessly, and we appreciate that about her. I asked a couple ladies at fair yesterday, said, if tell me as a parent, when are times in your life that you've felt like giving up and where you had to be relentless? You couldn't stop even though you felt like it. The first mom, she says, grocery shopping. Can you guys relate to that? I mean, picture it. You have your cart, and you've just finally got it completely packed full. You've put the last can in the perfect spot so it doesn't fall out. And you're walking up to the checkout, and you're like, oh, the finish line is in sight. We've almost made it. And just as you're about to get up there, your 2-year-old has a meltdown. You're like, what do I do? Do I go ahead and pay for this stuff? My 2-year-old's melting down, and my frozen chicken is melting. What do I do? And all of a sudden, you're in this desperate, hopeless situation. The other one told the story. She says, well, how about when you have something important for the next day, and you know you need to be well rested? And it just so happens that that is the night that your child gets sick. And all of a sudden, you're up for the 5th time that night cleaning up vomit. And you're sitting there, and if you're like me, you're doing the math, and you're like, okay, I slept for 5 minutes. I think I was asleep, and then I dozed for 12 minutes. Maybe if you add it all together, I might get an hour of sleep tonight. And you're desperate. And the thing about Jesus, he says, never get tired of coming to me. He wants us to come to him. He wants us to come even begging, relentlessly coming to him. Reminds me of Psalm chapter 42, verse 1, where the psalmist says, so as my soul pants for the water, as the deer pant for the water, so my soul longs for you. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. And then if you fast forward to John chapter 4, verse 14, when Jesus says, anyone who drinks of me will never thirst again. He says, look, if you're thirsty, if you're desperate, come to me and I can satisfy. That's how we come, relentlessly. So then something else happens, and this is where the story gets a little weird. Starting at verse 27, we're going to see that this woman comes to Jesus rightlessly. Let's read verse 27. Jesus says, first, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Huh? Did Jesus really just call this woman a dog? What's up with that? Desperate mom and she's a dog? Well, in order to understand this passage, you need to understand kind of the context of what's going on. Remember that we were just talking in the earlier part of chapter 7. Jesus was teaching about what it means to be defiled, unclean before God versus holy before God. And so this woman, being a Gentile, but following them around, she would know that it's not appropriate for a Gentile woman to approach him. And she would also know that the Jews would refer to her as a Gentile dog. But you know what? Jesus doesn't actually use the same term that the Jews would use. He doesn't use that you're a scavenger dog sort of term. He uses a term that actually means puppies. And so he softens what she would expect to be called by a Jew. He softens it down to, hey, you're a puppy. Which puppies had more access to families than the scavenger dogs did. So that's unique. The other thing that he points out here, and we see this all throughout Scripture, is that Scripture has an ebb and flow, a rhythm to it, about the Jews first, then the Gentiles. Okay? God had his chosen people. He came to them, and then he allowed that to expand out to the Gentiles. And so Jesus here is saying, look, I'm here for the Jews. I'm here to teach to them. He says, let them be fed first. Let the children be fed first, which implies there's still another feeding to come. She's saying, I'm not here for the Gentiles yet. It's not your turn yet. And no, you're not a scavenger. You're a puppy. And her response is awesome. Now, most of us, even if someone called us a puppy, we would equate that. Here in America, we would say, what? You just insulted me. And here in America, we are all about establishing our rights. I mean, our country was founded on that, right? We have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We're all about our rights, and you better not try to take our God-given rights from us. I saw a startling example of this back in February. I was in the Capitol, and I was given a floor speech, and in the middle of my floor speech, protesters came in. And they filled the upper gallery, and they dropped down this banner, and they were chanting. And then on the outside, people took shoes and started pounding on the wall. And it was so disruptive that they had to call in security, stop everything, call in security, and haul these people out until everything calmed down. Because here in America, we've learned it's not just that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. We've learned that the person with the loudest bullhorn gets attention. We've learned that when it comes to our rights, we want what we want, and we want it now. That's what we deserve. That's how we function in America. And it's done well for us in a lot of cases. And so for us to try to understand this woman's humility, that's difficult. Because she doesn't come to him and say, it's about my rights. She says it's about who you are. I love the way that Timothy Keller puts this in his book, Jesus the King. By the way, a quick side note, if you want to follow along in a great book, Jesus the King, Timothy Keller. He teaches through, or he talks through the book of Mark, and you'll discover where we get a lot of our content up here. But the way he puts it, he says, she's not saying, Lord, give me what I deserve on the basis of my goodness. She's saying, give me what I don't deserve on the basis of your goodness. I need it now. That sort of faith is absolutely spectacular. She doesn't take offense. She doesn't defend her rights. She has a rightless assertiveness where she says, Jesus, I need it now. And guess what? Jesus, your crumbs are enough for me. It's amazing that this woman answered the parable within the parable. Can you guys think back to, remember, the disciples, everywhere they go, they're constantly grabbing Jesus and pulling him aside and saying, we don't get it. Can you explain it? This woman, she's sharp. And Jesus knows she's sharp. She doesn't miss a beat. She answers within the parable and says, your goodness, your crumbs, your leftovers are good enough for me, Jesus. And it's not about my goodness, it's about yours. And can I just have a little bit of it? I think how often, or how do we as individuals, when we come to Jesus, how do we come to him? How often we might come to him with more of a demand than a plea for help. Example would be, God, you gave me that husband, now you fix him. Right? As opposed to, God, my marriage is in trouble. Can you help me? Help me. Help me through this. Help me know what to do. Or, God, you gave me this job and you created that boss who's a jerk. Can you fire him? Smite that man. Take him out. As opposed to coming in and saying, God, would you help me to be a better worker? That I can be an influence on the people I work with? That's the type of attitude we should have. Not one that's about our rights that we have, but rightless assertiveness, saying, God, let your mercy flow through me in this situation. Please, please. So we see that she was relentless. We see that she came rightlessly. And we see Jesus' response. Verse 29 and 30. Then he told her, for such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. I love this. So after he tested her persistence, after he tested her pride, he gives her a long-distance miracle. I mean, the daughter's not even there, and he heals her. I wonder how many of us in here today are in need of a long-distance miracle. We feel like we're too far gone that Jesus couldn't save us. Maybe that's why you're here today. It's like your last hope. So I'm too far gone, or how could he ever fix my impossible situation? Well, let me tell you, Jesus is the absolute king of the long ball. Okay, football starting, had to go there. He is the creator, the inventor of the Hail Mary. When there's no hope remaining, all is lost, he knows how to win the game. I mean, think about his situation. Here you have someone who was betrayed by one of his followers, abandoned by the rest of his followers, was tortured, hung on a cross, died, stuck with a spear, and buried. How much more hopeless does it get? And you know what? He overcame that situation when he rose from the dead. And I'm telling you, if Jesus can overcome that situation, he can overcome anything that you and I are going through. We're never too far gone from him to receive a long-distance miracle. So let's talk about the friends that bring in the deaf man. They come expectantly. We'll see that. Chapter 7, verse 31. When Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis, there some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. I love that these friends, they come to Jesus expectantly. Basically, if you could just touch him, just put your hand on him, he's healed. And Jesus could have done that. He could have just put his hand on him right in front of the crowd and healed him. But that's not what Jesus does. Instead, he takes him. Actually, let's talk about expectantly first. Coming to Jesus expectantly before I get into actually what Jesus did. Oftentimes, we come to Jesus expectantly, and it doesn't work out for us like these guys. In fact, a couple weeks ago, I had done well with my tithe, and I was praying, God, I just did well with my tithe. I have now demonstrated to you that I could handle $500 million from the Powerball jackpot. And so I prayed expectantly that he has the power to give me the proper numbers. And lo and behold, I come and I didn't win. Darn it. Why not? So, wait a minute. So what's the deal with this coming to Jesus expectantly thing? I mean, is it that we can just come to him and ask for anything? Because obviously he doesn't grant us absolutely everything we ask for, or I'd be a billionaire by now. He doesn't do that. So how do we know what things to come to him expectantly for? We know by knowing his promises, by knowing his word. The things that we should come to him expectantly about are the promises that he's already given us. Promises like Jeremiah 29:11 that he knows the plans he has for us. Plans to prosper us. Plans for a future. Things like Proverbs 16:3, a promise that if you commit to the Lord whatever you do, that he will establish your path. Or promises like in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, where he says, cast your anxieties on me because I care for you. These are the promises of God. And when we come to him expectantly on his promises, he will not fail us. This is how we should come, expectantly on his promises. So now let's talk about the response. He takes the deaf man. He could have healed him right there in front of everyone. And he takes him off away from the crowd. And he goes through all this weird stuff. What's the deal with the fingers in the ear and everything? And you might think right here, well, he's going through a healing ritual. But if we think that, we've missed the rest of the 7 chapters so far. We've already learned that Jesus doesn't care a whole lot about man-made traditions. He's not into all the rituals of demons being exorcised and so forth. He's not into all that. So what's he doing? He's identifying with him on a personal level. I love that he took him away from the crowd. Here's someone who has probably been mocked and ridiculed and been the outcast his entire life. Because even in our culture now, we don't treat people properly when they're hard of hearing and they can't speak. Can you imagine being a schoolboy growing up like that? Even in modern culture now, the way that you'd be made fun of and teased, it's pretty sad. And so this guy is probably like, I don't want to be in the crowd. People are mean to me. And so Jesus takes him off away from all that. And then after getting over there, doing the stuff about the ritual, the fingers in the ears, well, think about what he's doing. He's speaking sign language. He's letting this guy know, I'm going to fix your ears. And he's saying, I'm going to identify and get personal with you. I mean, swapping spit with someone, that's about as personal as you can get. And he says, so he spits and he says, I'm going to heal your tongue. And then if you've ever been around a mute person, the way they communicate is usually with groans. And so what does Jesus do? He lets out a deep sigh. Ephatha. He lets out a groan. He's speaking his language. He's identifying with him. And then he heals him. For us, if you're here and you've felt like you've always been that outcast, and you're thinking, man, I thought all this, my feeling alone and isolated and being the outcast would end after high school, but it hasn't, and you still feel alone and ridiculed, Jesus can identify with you. He's been rejected. He knows what it's like to hang alone and be ridiculed. Or maybe that's not you. Maybe everything always goes your way. You're the top, you're the king of the hill. Things always go your way. Guess what? He can identify with that as well. He's the King of Kings. So whether you're on the top or on the bottom and everything in between, he identifies with us. He knows what we need. And he personally, individually gives us what we need. I think it's similar to, coming to Jesus is similar to a suit that has been specially designed for each of us, or a dress designed to fit you uniquely and individually before a special event. Jesus tailors all of our experiences and our miracles around what he knows we need. And we need him. And so he identifies with us. We're going to talk for just a minute about how these individuals, the different ways that they connected people to Jesus. First, we have the mom who intercedes on behalf of her child. I think about, how desperate we can be sometimes and how much we need to intercede for other people. And I want to remind you, whether you are interceding for your daughter or son who is yet to give their life to Jesus, or maybe you're interceding in prayer for your mom or your dad who's struggling with cancer, or maybe you're interceding for your neighbor who's struggling with alcohol, or your friends whose marriage is on the rocks. Jesus says, I don't get tired of you coming. Keep on coming. Even when you think I haven't answered, keep coming to me. Don't grow weary. Come with a expectant, relentless, rightless attitude. He says, keep coming. So we see that with this woman. The other thing is we see that the friends introduce their friends to Jesus. And introducing someone to Jesus can be hard sometimes. I liken it to a couple construction workers, a couple guys that are, they're at the end of the day and maybe something amazing happened that day and they're helping, someone save the other one's life even. They're falling, they grab them, keep them from falling. And you ever watch two guys that are not good at communicating try to say something sentimental? It doesn't work. Like, I just saved your life, and you're like, oh, you just saved my life. That's a cool hammer. Like, for some reason, it can be so difficult to say the important things in life. I don't know why it is. But I want to give you just a couple conversation starters when it comes to talking about Jesus. They're not a magic bull or magic pill or a silver bullet or anything like that. They're just a couple tools you could use to get you thinking about how to start conversations with people. The most basic of them is to ask someone, how can I pray for you? I mean, nobody turns down prayer. A couple weeks ago, I called someone who's one of the most liberal people that I know, who's not a believer, and I said, I know you're going through a tough time. How can I pray for you? And guess what? He gave me a whole list of stuff. People don't turn down prayer, not very often, and it opens doors. Another one is non-threatening as can possibly be, is say, hey, would you tell me about where you're at in your faith journey? I mean, our country's all about faith. So where are you at in your faith journey? And that usually leads to a conversation. And usually you dialogue back and forth about where both of you are at. It's a wonderful thing. Or another thing is, hey, can I tell you about something cool that God's been doing in my life? I mean, when you come up to someone, you're like, I'm really excited about this. Can I tell you about it? People say, sure, even if they don't want to listen. Right? Yesterday, something really cool happened for my son at fair. We were super excited. And when I was driving to church from the fair, my wife calls me and she says, I have to tell someone about this. Who can I call? We'll let him call grandma. Maybe I can call my mom and tell them. Right? When we're excited about what's happening in our life and we want to tell people, they listen. So let's get excited about Jesus. And if we're not excited about him, we're probably not looking and paying attention to what he's doing in our life. Let's get excited and tell people. The point of all this is that we be openly Christian. If you were to go out to lunch with a half a dozen people from here, as soon as we leave in a little while, the way that you talk with those individuals, the Christianese that we use, if we were to talk that way with non-believers, in front of non-believers, we would have a lot more opportunities to share the gospel. Think about it. It's a way to go. So, quick recap if you're taking notes there, okay, because I kind of skipped around on your notes. Jesus' response to the desperate mom, he tested her persistence, he tested her pride, and then he gave her a long-distance miracle. For the deaf man, his response to the deaf man is he identifies with him. So what can we learn from these responses? The first thing I hope that all of us learn is that Jesus extends his grace to those who call on him. He doesn't withhold it from anyone. His love, the crumbs of his love, are enough for us, and he has plenty to go around. And you don't even need his crumbs. You can have it all. The next thing we can learn is that Jesus tailor-makes our experiences and our miracles. He wants to identify with each and every one of us individually. I like how this closes out in Mark chapter 7, verse 37. says, people were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. If you want Jesus to touch your life in a way where you can't help but speak about him, a way that he's touched my life, that's why I'm always trying to get up here and tell you guys even more. If you want him to touch your life in a way that you can't help but be amazed and speak about him, then I encourage you, come to him with a relentless expectation that he wants to connect with you. And he wants to connect you and others to him. Come to him with a relentless expectation that he wants to connect with you individually. Let's pray.